Hey guys, tonight we drift back to a world lit by lantern flame and lined with canvas tents, where a river once carried whispers of gold through quiet mountain stone. Before we begin, settle into whatever makes you comfortable tonight. A blanket, a dim room, maybe the soft hum of a fan somewhere nearby. If you'd like, you're welcome to comment where you're watching from tonight and what time it is where you are. I always enjoy imagining all the different corners of the world drifting off together. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, close your eyes for a moment and imagine cold water moving over smooth stones, high in a range of forested mountains, far from any city, far from any road. It is the winter of 1848. You are standing at the edge of a sawmill under construction along a river the local Nissinan people have known for generations by another name entirely. The air smells of pine resin and wet earth. A man named James Marshall crouches at the water's edge, inspecting the tail race of the mill he is building for John Sutter. He notices something small, something that catches the pale morning light in a way ordinary stone does not. Historians still return to this exact moment when tracing how one riverbed changed the shape of a continent. What Marshall found that January morning were flakes of gold, unassuming, barely larger than a fingernail, resting quietly among the gravel. You can imagine the strange, private stillness of that discovery. No crowds, no fanfare, just a man alone with cold water numbing his fingers, turning something over in his palm, uncertain if it was truly what he suspected. There is a gentle irony historians often note. Sutter, the land's owner, wanted the discovery kept quiet. He worried, correctly, that gold would draw more people than his fragile settlement could withstand. For a few months, the secret held, fragile as morning mist over the water. But secrets rarely survive contact with hope. By spring, word had slipped beyond the valley, carried first through soldiers, then merchants, then newspapers hungry for a story that felt almost too vivid to be true. Some accounts describe a merchant named Sam Brannan walking through the streets of San Francisco, holding a small vial of gold dust aloft, calling out that fortune waited in the hills. Whether every detail of that scene happened exactly as remembered remains gently uncertain, the way many origin stories soften at their edges over time. But the effect was unmistakable. Within weeks, San Francisco itself seemed to empty. Sailors abandoned ships anchored in the bay. Shopkeepers closed their doors mid-transaction. Farmers left crops unharvested in the fields. You might picture it as a kind of quiet fever spreading outward, town by town, letter by letter, rumor by rumor. There's something tender in imagining the scale of longing that drove so many people toward a single riverbank. Farmers burdened by debt, young men with no inheritance waiting for them, immigrants seeking a future their home countries could not offer. Each carried a private hope, folded carefully like a letter meant to be opened only in success. By the time you reach this point in the story, the mountains above Sutter's Mill were still largely silent, untouched by the wave of footsteps soon to arrive. For a brief window, the land held its secret the way still water holds a reflection just before the wind disturbs it. Soon, that stillness would break entirely. Word would spread across oceans, not just states. Ships from Chile, from China, from the eastern coast of America would begin turning their course towards San Francisco Bay. A quiet valley would soon bear the footprints of tens of thousands of strangers, all chasing the same shimmering promise glimpsed once in a tail race of cold mountain water. If you find these sleepy tales comforting, you can like and subscribe, but only if it feels right. For now, let the mountains rest one more night in their solitude before the world arrives to change them forever. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. By early summer of 1848, the valley around Sutter's Mill no longer resembled the quiet clearing James Marshall had once worked alone. You might imagine arriving there for the first time, stepping off a muddy trail into a landscape reshaped almost overnight. Canvas tents rose in uneven rows along the riverbank, their pale fabric catching the afternoon light like scattered petals across the hillside. There was no town plan, no surveyor's grid, no council deciding where a street should run or where a well should be dug. People simply arrived, and where they stopped walking, they began to live. Historians describe this earliest phase of a rush with a kind of quiet astonishment, noting how quickly a settlement can form when enough strangers share a single, urgent hope. Within weeks, a place with no name became a place with thousands of footprints, though still no formal identity of its own. You can imagine the sound of that first summer. Axes striking timber, canvas snapping in the wind. The murmur of unfamiliar languages overlapping near the riverbank as prospectors began arriving not just from nearby towns, but from far beyond California's borders. Some had walked for weeks. Others had sailed for months, enduring storms and disease aboard overcrowded ships bound for a bay that, until recently, few outside the region had ever thought to visit. It's worth pausing gently here to consider the sheer improbability of it all. A single riverbed discovery, and suddenly the ordinary rhythms of thousands of lives simply stopped, replaced by a singular, shared direction, west toward gold. Not everyone who arrived found what they expected. The earliest claims were remarkably informal. A miner might simply lay stones in a rough square around a promising patch of riverbank, an unspoken agreement forming among nearby prospectors that this small boundary now belonged to him, at least for as long as he could defend it through presence and effort. There was no deed, no registry, no law enforcement to appeal to if a dispute arose. And yet, remarkably, most early camps functioned with a surprising degree of informal order, built not from written law, but from necessity and mutual survival. Some historians describe this as one of the more curious aspects of the early rush, a temporary, self-organizing society formed almost entirely from strangers, operating without any of the institutions usually considered essential to civil order. Others caution against romanticizing this period too heavily. Disputes did happen. Tempers, worn thin by exhaustion and uncertain fortune, sometimes flared into violence. The absence of formal law was not always gentle, even if it was for a time functional. You might picture the emotional texture of those early days as something quietly fragile. Hope, yes, but also loneliness. Many miners had left behind wives, children, entire lives, gambling months or years of separation against the uncertain promise of gold. Letters home during this period, preserved in archives and private collections, often carry a tone historians find quietly moving. Optimism laced with homesickness, excitement tempered by the slow realization that fortune was neither guaranteed nor evenly distributed. As the first tents multiplied into rough clusters, something resembling a settlement began to emerge almost by accident. A trader might set up a simple table selling flour and salted meat. Another might offer basic tools, pickaxes, pans, shovels, priced at whatever the growing demand would allow. It's a detail often lost in the more dramatic retellings of the gold rush, that some of the earliest and most stable fortunes were made not by panning river gravel, but by selling to those who did. Still, in these earliest weeks, that distinction had not yet become clear. Everyone believed the river held enough for everyone. That belief, innocent and shimmering, would not last the way the canvas tent's fragile whiteness would not stay clean for long against the mud. For now, though, the camp remained a place of raw beginning, untitled, unmapped, unclaimed by any name that history would remember. But soon, this nameless gathering of tents and hope would begin to take shape into something the world would come to call a boomtown. Even as the first tents multiplied along the riverbank, another story was unfolding hundreds and thousands of miles away, in places that had never heard the name Sutter. nor thought much of California at all. You might imagine a farmhouse in Ohio, a fishing village in China, a mining town in Wales, a port in Chile. In each of these places, news of gold arrived differently, carried by newspaper, by letter, by word passed hand to hand until it barely resembled the original account. And yet, wherever it landed, it stirred something remarkably similar, a quiet, restless hope that perhaps this, finally, was a chance worth risking everything for. There is a gentle tenderness in imagining how differently that hope translated into action, depending on where a person stood on the globe. For those already living along the American East Coast, the journey west presented an immediate and difficult choice. Overland travel meant crossing nearly 2,000 miles of prairie, desert, and mountain range, an undertaking historians describe as grueling even under the best conditions. Wagon trains, often organized loosely among strangers who had never met before setting out together, faced unpredictable weather, dwindling supplies, and the constant risk of disease. Cholera, in particular, proved devastating along certain stretches of the trail, spreading quickly through crowded camps that lacked clean water. Some historians estimate that disease claimed more lives along these overland routes than any other single cause, a somber detail often overshadowed by the more romanticized imagery of golden riverbanks and prospectors' luck. For others, the sea offered an alternative, though hardly an easier one. Ships departing from East Coast ports faced a choice between two demanding routes. One meant sailing south around Cape Horn at the tip of South America, a journey lasting months and notorious for violent storms. The other involved landing in Panama, crossing the narrow isthmus by canoe and mule through dense jungle, then waiting, sometimes for weeks, for passage on a northbound ship along the Pacific coast. You can imagine the strange intimacy of that Panama crossing. Strangers from wildly different backgrounds, sharing narrow canoes along muddy rivers, mosquito nets barely keeping the tropical night at bay, all bound briefly together by the same distant hope waiting somewhere north. Historians note that this crossing, while faster in theory, carried its own significant dangers, particularly tropical disease, which claimed a considerable number of travelers before they ever reached California's shore. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, ships from southern China began carrying their own hopeful travelers, many from the Guangdong region, where economic hardship and social upheaval made the distant promise of California, referred to in Cantonese as Gumsan, or Gold Mountain, an especially powerful draw. It is worth pausing here to appreciate the poetry hidden in that translation. Gold Mountain, not simply a place of wealth, but something closer to myth, a distant peak glowing faintly on the edge of imagination, promising transformation to those willing to cross an ocean to reach it. Some historians debate the exact numbers of early Chinese immigrants arriving during these first years, records from the period being inconsistent and often incomplete. What remains clear, however, is that by the early 1850s, thousands had made the crossing, adding yet another thread to the increasingly diverse tapestry gathering along California's rivers. Travelers from Mexico, particularly from the state of Sonora, brought with them mining expertise that would prove invaluable in the diggings, many arriving with technical knowledge far more advanced than that of inexperienced American prospectors freshly arrived from farms and cities. You might imagine, then, this remarkable and fragile convergence. People who, under almost any other circumstance, would never have crossed paths, now standing shoulder to shoulder along the same muddy riverbank, united by a shared and uncertain hope. Language barriers softened slowly into practical necessity. Trade required communication. Survival required cooperation, at least in these earliest days, before scarcity would later harden many of these same relationships into something far less gentle. For now, though, the roads and oceans remained full of movement. Wagons creaking over dry plains, ships rising and falling against Pacific swells. Somewhere ahead, waiting quietly beneath a golden haze of dust and smoke, A nameless collection of tents was slowly beginning to resemble something closer to a town. By the time you might picture yourself walking through the settlement again, something had shifted. The nameless cluster of tents had begun, almost without anyone deciding it, to resemble a town. Streets had not been planned so much as worn into existence, footpaths widening gradually as more people passed over the same muddy ground day after day. A rough central path emerged, lined unevenly with canvas structures, wooden frames, and the occasional building constructed from milled lumber hauled in at considerable expense. You can imagine the particular sound of that transformation. Hammering, the creak of new signboards swinging in the wind, voices calling out prices for goods that, only months earlier, would have seemed impossibly expensive anywhere else in the country. Historians often highlight this period as one of the more fascinating aspects of Boomtown development. The astonishing speed at which informal survival gradually organized itself into something resembling civic structure, though still without any official government overseeing it. Saloons appeared early and multiplied quickly. Some were little more than a plank balanced across two barrels, offering whiskey poured into tin cups for prices that would have seemed outrageous back east. Yet miners paid gladly, exhausted from days spent in cold water, hungry for company as much as drink. There is a gentle sadness historians sometimes note in these gathering places. For many, the saloon offered not simply entertainment, but a rare moment of human connection in an otherwise isolating existence, far from family, far from any familiar face. Gambling tables emerged alongside the drinking. Card games played beneath lantern light late into the night. Fortunes occasionally won or lost as quickly as they had been pulled from the riverbed that same afternoon. Some accounts describe miners gambling away weeks of hard-earned gold dust in a single evening, a detail that captures both the desperation and the strange lightness with which many treated sudden wealth. It's worth noting, gently, that this behavior puzzled outside observers at the time and continues to interest historians today. Why would someone risk gold earned through such grueling labor so casually? Some suggest it reflected the fragile, almost unreal nature of the wealth itself. Gold that had appeared from nowhere might just as easily disappear again, and so it was spent or lost without the caution one might expect. Alongside the saloons, more practical establishments took root. Blacksmiths set up forges to repair tools worn down by daily use. Bakers built simple ovens from river clay, producing bread that, however plain, offered comfort amid the mud and uncertainty. You might imagine the particular smell of that early town, a strange mixture of wood smoke, fresh sawdust, and the earthy scent of turned river soil, layered beneath the sharper tang of unwashed clothing and long days spent bent over cold water. Law in these earliest months remained almost entirely informal. Miners often organized loose codes among themselves, sometimes referred to by historians as miners' law, an unwritten system of shared expectations around claim boundaries, theft, and basic conduct. Punishment for serious offenses could be swift and severe, occasionally disproportionate to the crime itself, a reflection of how quickly fear could spread through a community with no formal courts to appeal to. Historians remain divided on how uniformly fair these informal systems truly were, noting that outcomes often depended heavily on who held influence within a particular camp. And yet, remarkably, many of these early settlements functioned reasonably well, at least for a time, held together not by law, but by the shared understanding that survival depended on a fragile, mutual cooperation. Merchants, meanwhile, began to recognize something many miners had not yet fully grasped. The true fortune of the boomtown might not lie only in the riverbed, but in supplying those who worked it. A pound of flour, sold for pennies in San Francisco, might fetch many times that price once carried up into the diggings. Boots, blankets, simple tools, all of it commanded prices that reflected not their manufacturing cost, but the desperate convenience of not having to travel days to obtain them. You might sense, even now, the quiet irony beginning to take root here, one that would grow more pronounced as the rush continued. That fortune, in a gold rush, does not always favor those closest to the gold itself. For now, though, the town continued rising, board by board, tent by tent, still without a name that history would remember, but no longer without a shape. If you were to follow a single miner through an ordinary day, you might begin to understand why so many letters home carried a certain quiet exhaustion beneath their hopeful words. Mornings began early, often before full daylight, the air along the riverbank still holding the sharp chill of night. You can imagine waking inside a canvas tent, blankets damp from condensation, boots stiff with cold, the sound of the river already audible in the near distance, patient and indifferent to whatever the day might bring. Breakfast, when there was time for one, tended toward simplicity. Hardtack, perhaps, or a plain biscuit cooked over a small fire. Coffee, when available, was treated almost as a luxury, brewed strong enough to cut through the fatigue that seemed to settle permanently into a miner's bones after weeks of physical labor. Historians note that diet during this period was often poor, heavy in preserved meat and starch, light in the fresh produce that might have prevented some of the illnesses, particularly scurvy, that quietly plagued many mining camps. It's a detail easy to overlook amid the more dramatic imagery of gold, yet it shaped daily life profoundly. The work itself began with wading into cold river water, often up to the knees or higher, temperatures barely above freezing even in the warmer months, fed as they were by mountain snowmelt somewhere far upstream. You might imagine the particular discomfort of that first contact each morning, the shock of cold water against already tired legs, a sensation many accounts describe as something you never fully grew used to, no matter how many weeks passed. Panning itself required a deceptively simple motion. A shallow pan filled with river gravel and water, swirled gently in a particular rhythm designed to let heavier gold settle toward the bottom while lighter sediment washed away over the pan's edge. In theory, elegant. In practice, physically demanding, requiring hours of repetitive motion, arms and shoulders aching long before any meaningful result appeared. Some days offered a few promising flecks. Many offered nothing at all. There's a particular emotional texture historians often highlight when describing this daily rhythm. The strange psychological toll of labor whose reward remained entirely unpredictable. Unlike farming, where effort and season generally correlated with results, gold mining offered no such reliable relationship between work and outcome. You might sense in that uncertainty something quietly destabilizing. A miner could work an entire week with nothing to show for it, then discover, almost by accident, a pocket of gravel rich enough to sustain hope for another month. As techniques developed, some miners began using more advanced tools. The rocker box, a simple wooden cradle rocked back and forth to process larger quantities of gravel more efficiently than a single pan allowed, became common by the rush's second year. Later, sluice boxes, long wooden channels lined with riffles to trap heavier gold particles, allowed even greater quantities of earth to be processed. Historians sometimes debate how quickly these innovations spread between camps. Given the isolation of many mining communities and the informal, word-of-mouth nature through which most practical knowledge traveled. By midday, if a miner paused at all, it was usually only briefly, a simple meal eaten standing or crouched beside the claim, eyes still drawn instinctively back toward the water. Evenings brought a different kind of exhaustion, less physical perhaps, but no less real. You might imagine the particular quiet of returning to camp as daylight faded, muscles aching, hands raw and cracked from prolonged exposure to cold water and abrasive gravel. Many miners kept simple diaries during this period, brief entries recording weather, small finds, occasional letters received from home. Reading these accounts today, historians often note a recurring emotional undercurrent. Not despair exactly, but a kind of patient, weathered endurance, the quiet discipline of continuing to hope even when daily results offered little encouragement. Some nights ended around shared fire, voices low, stories exchanged about camps further upstream where fortune reportedly ran richer. Other nights ended simply in exhausted sleep, the sound of the river continuing outside the tent, indifferent and unceasing, exactly as it had sounded the night before and would sound again the next. There is a particular story historians enjoy telling, not because it involves gold itself, but because it illustrates something quietly essential about how fortune actually worked in a boomtown. A young immigrant named Levi Strauss arrived in San Francisco in the early 1850s, not to mine, but to sell dry goods. Among his merchandise, sturdy canvas material intended for tents and wagon covers. It was only later, working alongside a tailor named Jacob Davis, that the idea emerged to reinforce work trousers with copper rivets at the stress points, creating a durable garment miners badly needed. You might find it quietly amusing, in a gentle way, that one of the most enduring legacies of the entire gold rush was not gold at all, but a pair of trousers designed to survive the wear of kneeling on riverbank gravel. This pattern repeated itself throughout the Boomtown economy, again and again, in ways easy to overlook amid the more dramatic stories of sudden riches. Consider the price of everyday goods during this period. Eggs, historians note, sometimes sold for what would today amount to several dollars each, an extraordinary sum for something so ordinary, driven upward by the sheer difficulty and cost of transporting fresh food into remote mining regions. A simple wooden crate that once held nails might, once emptied, sell for a price that would have seemed absurd anywhere else, valued now for its usefulness in a place where lumber itself remained scarce and expensive. You might picture the peculiar logic of this economy taking shape, one where scarcity, not labor alone, determined value, and where the true fortune often belonged not to the person swinging the pickaxe, but to the person who had anticipated what that pickaxe swinger would eventually need. Merchants who established themselves early, particularly those who secured reliable supply routes from San Francisco, found themselves in a position of remarkable advantage. Some historians estimate that certain successful shopkeepers accumulated wealth during this period that rivaled, or even exceeded, the fortunes of many successful miners, achieved with considerably less physical hardship. There's a gentle irony worth sitting with here. Thousands crossed oceans and deserts chasing gold pulled directly from riverbeds, while some of the boomtown's quietest fortunes were built instead from flour sacks, tin pans, and sturdy canvas trousers. Women, though a minority in these earliest mining camps, often found unexpected economic opportunity as well. Historians note that laundering, cooking, and boarding house management, tasks considered mundane or domestic in more established communities, became remarkably profitable services in a population overwhelmingly composed of men living far from any domestic support. Some accounts describe women earning, through laundry services alone, sums that occasionally exceeded what many miners managed to extract from their claims in a comparable period. It is a detail historians find quietly significant, complicating simplified narratives that center the gold rush entirely around male prospectors. You might imagine, then, a boomtown economy far more layered and interconnected than the popular image of solitary miners crouched beside riverbanks might suggest. Blacksmiths repairing worn tools, bakers selling bread at prices that would have seemed impossible elsewhere, merchants extending informal credit to miners between finds, understanding that today's debt might become tomorrow's loyal customer, provided the gold eventually appeared. Not every merchant prospered, of course. Some overextended credit to miners who never returned to pay it. Others invested heavily in goods that arrived just as prices unexpectedly collapsed, undone by the same volatile supply and demand that had made others suddenly wealthy. Historians caution against romanticizing merchant success too uniformly, noting that this economy, while offering alternative paths to fortune, remained just as unpredictable in its own way as the riverbed itself. Still, as the Boomtown continued expanding through 1849 and into 1850, one pattern grew increasingly clear to those paying close attention. Gold, however central to the town's origin story, was slowly becoming only one thread among many in an economy far more complex, and in some ways, far more human than its glittering name might suggest. By 1852, if you had walked the length of the mining district, you might have noticed something the earlier months had only hinted at: the sheer diversity of voices now filling the camps. You might recall, from earlier in this journey, the ships already crossing oceans toward California, carrying travelers from lands with vastly different histories and expectations. By this point, those journeys had delivered thousands of new arrivals, and the Boomtown had grown into something far more layered than its earliest tints could have suggested. Chinese miners, many from the Pearl River Delta region, had established their own distinct presence within the mining districts by now. Historians note that Chinese immigrants often worked claims previously abandoned by others, sometimes reworking ground considered exhausted with a patience and technical care that occasionally yielded surprising results. You might imagine the quiet skill involved in that patience, extracting value from ground others had already dismissed, a kind of careful attentiveness that spoke to both necessity and expertise. Yet this success did not always earn goodwill. Historians describe growing resentment among some American miners, resentment that would eventually crystallize into discriminatory taxation, most notably the foreign miners' tax, which placed a particular financial burden disproportionately on Chinese and Latin American prospectors. It is a difficult thread in this story, one historians examine carefully rather than glossing over, recognizing that the Boomtown's diversity, while remarkable, existed alongside real and painful inequality. Mexican miners, particularly those from Sonora, brought with them mining techniques considerably more advanced than what many American newcomers possessed. Some historians describe Sonoran methods of ore processing and claim organization as directly influential in shaping broader mining practices later adopted throughout California, a contribution not always credited clearly in popular retellings of this period. You might sit for a moment with that quiet irony that expertise brought by immigrants often shaped the very industry that would later exclude and tax them unfairly. European immigrants added their own distinct presence as well. French prospectors, some fleeing political upheaval at home, established close-knit communities within certain camps, occasionally bringing with them small comforts of familiar food and language that offered brief solace amid an otherwise disorienting new world. German, Irish, and English miners arrived in similarly significant numbers, each group carrying its own particular blend of hope, hardship, and cultural memory into the shifting social fabric of the mining districts. And threaded quietly, painfully, through all of this arrival and ambition, remained the indigenous peoples whose homeland this had always been, long before any of these newcomers set foot along its rivers. Historians describe this period as devastating for California's native populations, particularly groups like the Nisenan, Miwok, and Maidu, whose traditional lands, hunting grounds, and fishing waters were disrupted and often violently seized as mining activity expanded. Disease, displacement, and at times direct violence dramatically reduced indigenous populations during these years, a somber and essential truth historians insist must be remembered clearly, without softening, alongside the more celebrated narratives of opportunity and fortune. You might allow yourself a quiet moment here, a pause not unlike those the river itself seemed to offer between one rush of water and the next, to sit with this difficult layered truth, that the same landscape offering opportunity to so many arriving strangers represented profound loss for those who had called it home for countless generations before gold was ever discovered. Historians continue to debate the full scope and details of this displacement. Records from the period often incomplete, shaped by the perspectives of those who documented them. Yet the broad outline remains clear and undisputed. The gold rush brought devastating consequences for indigenous communities, consequences whose effects extended long beyond the Boomtown years themselves. Amid all of this, remarkably, moments of genuine connection did occur. Trade relationships, shared labor, occasional friendships that crossed the boundaries otherwise hardening around ethnicity and origin. These moments, however brief or complicated, remind us that history rarely divides cleanly into simple categories of villain and victim, hope and harm. Instead, it holds all of these threads together at once, however uncomfortable that complexity might feel to settle into. By 1853, something quietly unmistakable had begun settling over the mining districts, a shift you might sense the way you notice a season changing before anyone speaks of it directly. The easy gold, the kind found simply by swirling a pan through loose surface gravel, had grown increasingly rare. Historians describe this transition carefully, noting that it happened gradually rather than all at once, river by river, claim by claim, as the most accessible deposits were slowly exhausted by the sheer volume of miners working them. You might recall from earlier in this journey that first quiet discovery in the tail race of Sutter's Mill, gold resting gently among ordinary gravel, waiting simply to be noticed. That kind of fortune, unearned by any particular skill or method, belonged now increasingly to memory rather than present possibility. In its place, mining itself began transforming into something far more industrial, far less personal. Hydraulic mining emerged during this period, a technique using powerful jets of water to blast entire hillsides apart, exposing gold deposits buried within ancient gravel beds that individual panning could never have reached. You might imagine the strange, almost violent beauty of this new method. Water forced through narrow nozzles with tremendous pressure, capable of moving earth on a scale no single miner with a simple pan could ever have imagined. Historians note the environmental cost of hydraulic mining was substantial, sediment washing downstream in quantities that would eventually clog rivers, damage farmland, and provoke some of the earliest environmental legal disputes in American history. It is a detail often overlooked in more romanticized retellings, yet historians consider it significant, an early example of industrial ambition outpacing consideration of long-term consequence. Alongside this shift came another quiet transformation. Individual miners, once able to work a claim alone or alongside a small group of companions, increasingly found themselves employed instead by larger mining companies, businesses with the capital necessary to purchase expensive equipment and organize labor on an industrial scale. You might sense in this shift something bittersweet. The independent prospector, arriving with little more than a pan and quiet determination, gradually gave way to something resembling ordinary wage labor. The same uncertain freedom that had drawn so many west, now slowly replaced by structured employment within someone else's enterprise. Not everyone experienced this transition with equal difficulty. Some miners adapted, finding steady, if modest income working for these emerging companies. Others left mining altogether, drawn instead toward California's growing agricultural and commercial opportunities, industries that historians note would ultimately prove far more economically significant to the state's long-term development than gold itself. There's a gentle irony worth sitting with here, one that echoes something noted earlier in this journey. The gold that drew so many across oceans and deserts would, within just a few short years, become only one thread among many in California's broader economic story, its glittering promise gradually settling into something more ordinary, more sustainable, though considerably less mythic. For those who remained determined to find their fortune specifically through mining, competition grew increasingly fierce. Claims that once seemed abundant were staked and restaked, boundaries disputed with greater frequency as available ground diminished. Historians describe growing tension during this period, disagreements over claim boundaries occasionally escalating into violence, a shift from the earlier, more cooperative spirit that had characterized the Rush's opening years. You might imagine the particular weariness settling over camps during this time, an exhaustion less physical than emotional, the slow recognition that the extraordinary promise which had drawn so many west was proving, as extraordinary promises often do, considerably more complicated in practice than it had appeared from a distance. And yet, remarkably, the Boomtown itself continued growing, even as the easy gold diminished. Buildings grew sturdier. Streets grew more defined. What had begun as a nameless scattering of canvas tents now increasingly resembled a genuine, permanent settlement. Its identity no longer tied exclusively to the shrinking promise of the riverbed that had first called it into being. If the slow exhaustion of easy gold had unsettled the Boomtown spirit, what followed in certain years tested something even more fundamental: whether the town itself could survive the very materials it had been built from. You might imagine the particular vulnerability of a settlement constructed so quickly, so improvisationally. Wooden buildings raised close together along narrow streets, canvas tents still scattered between more permanent structures, all of it dried by long summer heat into something historians describe, quite simply, as remarkably flammable. Fire, when it came, often came suddenly and spread with a speed that must have felt almost unbelievable to those who witnessed it. Historians recount several major fires sweeping through California mining towns and San Francisco itself during these early years. Entire districts reduced to ash within hours, the same rapid construction that had allowed the town to rise so quickly now working tragically against it. You might picture the particular helplessness of that experience. Buckets passed hand to hand toward flames that outpaced every effort to contain them. The acrid smell of smoke replacing, if only briefly, the more familiar sense of wood smoke and river mud that had defined daily life until that moment. Remarkably, historians note that many of these towns rebuilt with startling speed, sometimes within weeks, an early testament to a kind of resilience that would come to characterize much of California's subsequent development. Yet this resilience came with a cost. Some businesses never recovered. Some families, already living at the edge of financial stability, found themselves with nothing left to rebuild from it all. Fire was not the only disaster the young settlements faced. Flooding, too, proved devastating in certain years, particularly during unusually heavy winter rains that swelled rivers far beyond their ordinary banks. Historians describe entire camps submerged overnight, tents and modest buildings swept away entirely, mining equipment lost beneath water and mud that would take weeks to fully recede. You might sense, in these repeated disasters, a certain sobering truth beginning to settle over the Boomtown story, one perhaps easy to overlook amid the earlier excitement of discovery and arrival. That the same natural forces which had made this landscape rich with gold, its rivers, its seasonal rains, its dramatic mountain terrain, could just as easily turn destructive, indifferent entirely to the hopes and labor invested in the town below. There's a quiet historical debate worth mentioning here, gently, without resolving it entirely. Some historians argue that these repeated disasters, fire and flood alike, ultimately strengthened certain communities, forcing more durable construction, more organized civic cooperation, early forms of firefighting companies, and infrastructure that would shape California's later urban development. Others caution against too readily framing disaster as ultimately beneficial, noting the genuine human cost, the families displaced, the fortunes lost, the lives occasionally taken, that such a framing risks minimizing. Perhaps both perspectives hold some truth simultaneously. the way history so often resists simple, singular conclusions. Amid these disasters, you might also imagine quieter, more personal losses accumulating alongside the larger, more dramatic ones. A miner's saved earnings, kept in a small trunk within a tent, lost entirely to floodwater. A modest general store, built up carefully over several patient years, reduced to ash in a single night. Historians preserve letters from this period that carry a particular emotional weight, writers describing not despair exactly, but a kind of weary determination, an acceptance that building a life in this place required accepting risk as a constant, quiet companion. And yet, remarkably, few who experience these disasters seem to abandon the settlements entirely. Rebuilding continued, sometimes almost immediately, driven by a stubborn, quiet hope that had, by this point, become as much a part of the Boomtown's character as the gold that had first drawn everyone there. You might sense, in that persistent rebuilding, something quietly moving, a testament not to the promise of fortune exactly, but to the resilience of the people who had, by now, made this improbable place something closer to home. By the later 1850s, if you had returned to walk the same streets you first imagined taking shape years earlier, you might have noticed a quality settling over the town that felt, quietly, like something ending, even as other things clearly continued. The gold, historians note, had not vanished entirely, but its character had changed completely. What remained now required industrial extraction, corporate capital, and organized labor, far removed from the image of a lone prospector crouched beside a river with nothing but a tin pan and quiet hope. You might recall, gently, that very first image from the beginning of this journey. James Marshall alone at the water's edge, noticing something small catching morning light. That moment now belonged fully to memory, distant enough that some younger arrivals to the region had only ever heard it described secondhand, already softening into legend. Many of the boom towns that had risen so suddenly during the rush's earliest years began, one by one, to empty. Historians describe this pattern repeating throughout the mining districts, populations that had once numbered in the thousands dwindling, sometimes gradually, sometimes with surprising speed, as opportunities shifted elsewhere, toward California's growing cities, its expanding agricultural valleys, or entirely new mining discoveries emerging in places like Nevada and Colorado. You might imagine walking through one of these fading settlements during this period. Streets once crowded, now quiet. Buildings once bustling, now standing empty. Their windows catching afternoon light with a stillness that felt almost reverent, as though the town itself were resting after years of restless motion. Not every settlement faded, of course. Some towns, fortunate in location or adaptable in economy, transitioned successfully into permanent communities, their identities gradually shifting from mining camps into agricultural centers, transportation hubs, or simply quiet towns where descendants of the original rush settled into more ordinary, sustainable rhythms of life. Historians find something quietly poignant in tracing these divergent paths. Some towns preserved carefully today as historical sites, their wooden buildings maintained deliberately to honor this remarkable period, while others disappeared almost entirely, reclaimed slowly by the same landscape that had once been reshaped so dramatically to extract their fortune. You might sense, in this quiet divergence, a fitting final reflection on the Boomtown's deeper character. That impermanence, in many ways, had been present from the very beginning, woven quietly into a settlement built initially from canvas and hurried timber, existing always somewhat uncertainly between temporary camp and permanent home. The human legacy of this period, however, proved considerably more permanent than the towns themselves. California's population, essentially reshaped within less than a decade, carried forward the extraordinary cultural diversity first gathered along these rivers. Communities whose descendants would continue shaping the state's identity long after the gold itself had ceased to matter economically. Historians continue debating certain aspects of this legacy, the true demographic impact, the long-term economic significance, the full extent of environmental and indigenous displacement. These remain active areas of historical inquiry, appropriately so, given how profoundly this brief period reshaped an entire region's trajectory. Yet certain truths remain settled beyond serious dispute. That an extraordinary convergence of human hope, ambition, hardship, and consequence occurred here, compressed into a remarkably brief span of years. That ordinary people, farmers, immigrants, merchants, families, crossed oceans and deserts and mountain passes, drawn by a shimmer of possibility glimpsed once in a quiet mountain river. You might imagine, one final time, that original riverbank, quiet again now, decades removed from the frenzy it once witnessed. Water still moving patiently over smooth stones, indifferent, as rivers always are, to the extraordinary human history briefly gathered along its banks. Somewhere in that quiet, gold likely remains still, scattered thin among the gravel, waiting the way it always had, long before anyone thought to look, and long after everyone stopped searching quite so urgently. You can let your thoughts settle now, the way that river always did, smoothing itself over stone after stone, patient and unhurried. Somewhere behind you, in the quiet folds of this story, a whole world once rose from canvas and hope and vanished again just as gently, leaving behind only fragments. A weathered pan, a faded photograph, a single flake of gold, resting still beneath moving water. You carried for a while tonight the footsteps of farmers and sailors, merchants and dreamers, people who crossed oceans and deserts for nothing more certain than a shimmer glimpsed in someone else's letter. You walked their muddy streets. You felt the cold of their river mornings. You sat quietly beside their small fires as evening settled over tents that no longer stand. And now, as your own evening settles around you, perhaps you can let all of it rest gently in the soft space between memory and sleep. The rivers still move, somewhere, exactly as they did then. The hills still hold their quiet gold, scattered thin and patient, uncounted, unbothered by time. There is something comforting in that continuity, in knowing that history does not simply disappear, but folds softly into the landscape, into old wood and worn stone, into stories passed quietly from one drowsy night to the next. Let your breathing slow, the way the Boomtown itself slowed, board by board, street by street, into something calmer, something at peace. Wherever you are tonight, whatever town or river or quiet room holds you, know that you are held gently now, the way that valley once held so many hopeful strangers. Rest here a while longer. Sweet dreams.